Hello everyone and welcome to Microsoft Access 2016 Basics. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to do an introduction to forms. So in this video we're first going to try to understand what a form is. Then we're going to move on to discussing what a form is for. Next we'll see how to create a form as well as how to add our first set of controls to that form. And finally, we'll explore how to modify those controls on our form to present a much more useful interface for our users. So let's hop into Access. So here I've drawn up a basic form. And a form just kind of gives us these inputs and outputs for the user to interact with. So we have things like labels and text boxes and buttons, and these are all just different controls that appear on the form that the user can interact with. So labels are really for providing information to a user, and then we have these text boxes that allow the user to give us information. So I could do things like entering in my first name, my last name, and even some sort of comment. And we could even click on the Submit button. So how do we create one of these forms? Well, just simply go up to the Create tab up here. And from the Create tab, you'll notice there's this section called Forms. And in this Forms section, you'll notice there's just this basic form designer, this form creator. And then we have the form design, which is my favorite way to create a form. We could also select blank form, which just gives us a blank form, and then we have to decide what to do from there. We also have this form wizard, which gives us a nice little wizard interface, but I don't like using it too much because it gives us some default controls and stuff that the format just doesn't quite look right to me in most cases. We also have the ability to do some navigational type things, and if I click on the drop down here, you can see we can add a lot of different navigational controls. And then finally, there's this more form section where we can do things like creating a modal dialog, splitting a form, a datasheet, all sorts of good stuff. So how do we create this kind of form, this very basic form with inputs and outputs? So the way that I did this was go to the Form Design option, again, under the Create tab, and you'll notice that we get this canvas looking thing where we can kind of draw on. So we need to draw those different controls on this form. The first control that I want to add to this form would be that big giant label we see here that says My Basic Form. So to do that, I need to select from the Controls section under the Design tab. There's these controls, and I could select any one of these controls, but the one I'm looking for is this one here marked Label. And if I hover the mouse over it here, you can see there it says Label as this alternate text. So I want to click on that Label control, and then I'm just going to kind of drag and release to the size that I think I want it to be. Okay? And now I could just type in what it is I want to show on this label, which was just my basic form. Now you'll notice that the size of the text or the size of the font in this label is not anywhere close to what we have here at the top. So how do we change this? Well, first you need to make sure that you have the label control selected, and you can see that this is the selected control because we've got this orange outline. Okay, and that orange outline shows us that this is in fact the control that we've selected. And from here, I can go up to the Home tab, and under the Home tab, we see this text formatting section where I can change the font size to 36. Okay, so now the font size is the right size, but we've got a little bit of a problem in that the size that I originally drew this label is not big enough. So how can we adjust the size of our labels? Well, once again, I can select the control, and you'll notice these different orange tabs at each one of the corners as well as each one of the sides of this control. And I could select the side one here, and this allows me to move it kind of horizontally to adjust the size that way. And then there's another one here that allows us to do vertically. But I actually want to do both at the same time, which is what you can do with these little corner controls. So I'm going to click on this this bottom right corner control, and I'm just going to click on that and then drag it to the size that I want it to be. And maybe I'll adjust, it's a little too tall, so I'm just going to click on that one and drag it up a little bit, and there we go. There's a good size, I think, for my label. Now additionally, this isn't really centered quite right. I mean, that's okay. It's not quite in the middle of my form. I'm going to click on this a little bit and drag it over. And so notice that I'm clicking on the edge of my control to move it around. I'm going to click on this. You'll see this little cross appear. And I can click and drag my control over to where I want it to be positioned. So I'm just going to do that right there. So it's a little bit more center. Maybe not perfect, but it's good enough for me. And now it's time to add some inputs and these labels that go along with those input text boxes. So to do that, once again, I'm going to go to the Design tab, and I'm going to select this one here, this text box control. And instead of dragging and sizing the text box the way I want it, I'm just going to use the default to start with. And the way you have the default size of a control is to just simply click and let go. And that will drop in that particular control with its default sizing. So this is actually pretty good size for me, but I don't like how this label has appeared all the way over to the left. And notice that when I did create this text box, it did associate a label with it automatically, which is pretty good because most of the time, whenever you have a text box on the screen that you want a user to give input for, you typically need to associate it with some sort of label to let the user know what that input text box is for. So I like having this label, and you'll notice that they're kind of bound together. When I click on one, both of them are actually kind of activated here. And I can tell that they're bound together because if I drag this input text box around, the label comes right along with it. So they're kind of bound together. All right, so I want to move this over a little bit. I'm going to change the label to say first name. And I need to make it so that this text box, even though these two items are bound together, I want to move this text box to be right up against the edge of the label. And to do that, you'll notice there's this gray box up in the top left corner that will allow you to move items individually, even if they are bound to other objects. So if I just click on this gray box here, I can move it over right up against that first name label, and there we go. Okay, so there's my first name label. What about my, there's my first name text box. What about my last name? And I kind of want to adjust this a little bit. I'm going to move this up here. Actually, before I move on to the last name, another thing that I should tell you about in order to kind of incrementally and slowly move these controls around on your screen is you can have a control highlighted and then just use your arrow keys to just kind of move it around on the screen. So if you kind of want to just do some of these more fine positional changes, you can use the arrow keys to kind of move that control. Okay, so let's go ahead and make that last name control. So I'm going to click on my input text box here, and I'm going to press Control C, which is the copy function. And then to paste it on my form, I'm going to press Control V. So that's just the simple copy and paste controls that you would typically use, on any computer. So now I've got my first name duplicated. I just need to change what's here in my label to say last name, and there we go. Now, what about that comment text box, right? What if I want to add that one? So once again, I want to copy this, but I'm going to show you that there's another way you can copy a control besides Control C, Control V. And that is I can once again select the control and then right click, and you'll see that we get this context menu where we can select the copy option. And then I can click anywhere on my canvas here of the form and right click again, and now I can select paste, and that will drop that control on my form. But you will notice that it goes all the way up to the top left corner. So that's just kind of one reason why I prefer the Control C, Control V, is because it kind of automatically pastes it where it seems logical to put it. But if you want to use the mouse because you just feel more comfortable with it, you can do that, and then you could just simply drag it and drop it where you want it to show. So let's just go ahead and change that last name to comment. And now I want to resize this text box. And once again, the way you resize a control is to just simply take one of these corners or one of the edges and resize it to the size that you want. Okay, now the last control I want to add to this form would be the submit button. So I'm going to go up here to the controls again, and I'm going to click on the submit button, or I should say the button control. And once again, I'm just going to click and let go. I'm not going to drag and resize or any of that. I'm just going to click once, and that will give us a default button. And we can see that there's this wizard that appears that gives us some different default behaviors we could select, like a record navigation, application type stuff. There's miscellaneous controls. Each one of these select the application if I wanted to quit out of the application altogether, or if I wanted to close the form, all sorts of good kind of automatic things. Now, I'm not going to do any of those things right now. I'm going to show you how to program the behavior of your controls a little bit later on in this series. So instead of doing one of these default actions, I'm just going to click on the cancel button so that there is no behavior that this control is going to do. Now I'm just going to go ahead and go to my Command 7 here, just kind of highlight the text and change it to submit. And I need to move this around. I'm going to use the arrow keys to just kind of do some fine tuning of its position. Perfect. Okay, so this is starting to look pretty close to the form that I have here. Looking pretty good. So how do I see this form? How do I see what it looks like to the user? How do I go over to this view where it looks like this on the screen? So to do that, you can go over to, under the Design tab, we'll see this Views option here. And I can click on the drop down and you'll see I have a few different views that I can select. I can do a form view, datasheet view, layout view, and design view. And right now we're on the design view, which gives us this nice designer where we can drag and drop all our controls. But I want to actually see what the form looks like. So I'm going to select the form view. And this is essentially, this is the form that we have right here under my basic form. Now you may be wondering, how did we end up with this control on the left and these controls on the bottom? How did that occur? Well, this is by default one of the ways that Access behaves when you create a form, is it creates this thing called a record selector, and then the ability to navigate through records, because at its heart, Access is a database management system. We're trying to access records and move through them. So this would be record 1 of 1, and I could actually bind this form to some sort of data, like a query or a table. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on in this series, but it's just interesting to note that Access by default has some of these controls that allows us to navigate through the records of data in our database. But for now, I want to get rid of these things. So I'm going to go back into the design view of my form, and I can either go up here to where we have the different views and select design view. Or one of my favorite ways to do it is just to simply right-click on the tab and then select the design view from there. Okay, so we're back to our design view, and I need to remove those controls on my form. So how do I do that? Because they don't appear here on the left or the bottom of my designer, and that's because they are default controls added by Access that I simply need to toggle on and off. And you can do this on each form that you have in your application. So to do that, you need to actually select the entire form. So remember how I was able to select things like the label and the text boxes and the buttons, and I was able to move those things around. How do you select the entire form? Well, you'll notice that there's this little box right here in the upper left corner of your form. And if you click on this little box, you'll get this little black square inside of that box, which means you're now actually looking at the properties of the form. And what do I mean by you're looking at the properties of the form? Well, notice that there's this property sheet over here on the right. So this property sheet allows us to change the properties of the items we've selected. Either the whole form or maybe the details section of the form. You'll notice that there's some properties there. We also have the properties of things like the labels and the text boxes, right? So let's say, for example, I wanted to change the color of this label because it's, it's kind of basic. It's kind of this bland gray. What if I wanted to change the color of the font? So let's say I want to change the color. I'm going to go over here to the property sheet, and we'll see that there's this for color property that's currently set to text 1 lighter 50%. And if I click on this drop down, this gives us kind of some of these different theme and system basic color schemes. So I could go system scroll bar, I could go to system button face, Ooh, that's kind of ugly. Menu bar. So there's kind of these default color schemes based upon Windows and Access themes. And I don't really want to do that blue one here. What if I want to select, instead of one of these theme-based colors or default colors, I want it to be very specific about a color. So that's what this little ... what we call an ellipsis, that button there gives us access to this more colors control, where we can select theme colors based upon the default theme of Access, or we can pick from standard colors, or even go to this more color section where we have this very complex RGB model or hex system. If you know what hex control colors are, you can even use this kind of crosshairs to pick a specific color, and then we can use this little dial here to change the darkness. But what I want to do is I just kind of want to use one of the default colors here of this maroon, the standard color of maroon. And now we've changed that text to maroon. We could do other things too, like we could change the font size. Notice that we can change the font name and the font size, which are the same two things that we were adjusting up here when we were under the Home tab. We had this text formatting, and we could change the color, the text size, and the font type. We could also have selected here to change the color scheme. But once again, we have this property sheet that gives us a lot of different things that we can do to the different controls on our form. So going back to what I was originally talking about, how I wanted to change, notice that we had no record selector here, no navigation items at the bottom, but when we were viewing our form that we were creating, they once again appear. And if I wanted to remove those things, I just need to go into the design view. I need to select my form and go to the property sheet where we can find, over here we see, there we go, navigation buttons, which is those bottom set of navigation items. And then we have this record selectors, and I want to change that to no also. So we're changing record selectors and navigation buttons to no. We save that. Let's go ahead and save the form and take a look at it. Aha! So we've gotten rid of our little navigation controls down here, and there's no record selector. And we basically have kind of the same form. It may not be positioned exactly. We can kind of move some of those controls around. Maybe that's what we'll do here. We'll make one last thing in this video, and that is how do we kind of move all of the controls all at once. So before we were selecting one control at a time, what if I want to select all the controls and move them around? So the way that you do that is just kind of drag across your screen. Once again, I'm using the arrow control, or the select control. And I could just kind of click on one side and just kind of drag across and let go, and I can select multiple controls. Another thing I could do is individually click on each one of these controls. So I can click on this one and then hold the control key down, and then select the next control and the next control and the next control, just holding the control key down and selecting each one of the controls. So you can do that. You can either highlight all of the controls all at once by just kind of dragging the mouse across, or you can individually select controls one at a time by holding the control key down while you click on each one of the controls, and it just kind of selects all of them as a group. And I can use the mouse control, the arrows on my keyboard to kind of move these controls around, or I can click on any one of these controls on the edge. Again, I'm not holding my control key down at this point, but I could just kind of click and drag it around and move it around to where I want it to be. So that kind of fits. That's a little bit closer probably. Let's go ahead and view that. Yeah, we're pretty close there. Right? We might have a little bit more adjustment to make, but that's pretty similar. So that's how you can create a form. That's how you can add controls to a form. That's how you can resize those controls and move them around on your screen. That's how you can change the properties of the different controls. And you can even change some of the properties on the form itself. I'd like to thank the following members for being a part of this community. Without your support, this channel would not be possible. Thank you.